Thank you. So this is a project with David Card, Benoit Dosti, Beryl, where are you? The very important part of this research team, where we're interested in looking at the careers of immigrants. And the networks part, you'll be disappointed. It's work in progress, and we're far from the networking effects. Networking meaning the social environment in which immigrants evolve, influencing their labor market outcomes as they go through from job to job, okay? So we'll focus on something else, reflecting what we've done so far. And if you have, and in keeping in tune with what I just told Benoit, if you have any beefs about this paper, contact the first author. Okay, so of interest to policymakers, of course, is how immigrants' careers and labor market earnings trajectory evolve over time. That's one dimension. There are other dimensions of immigrants' outcomes that interest policymakers, but that's the one we focus on. And we're interested also in which specific channels lead to possibly improved outcomes if the outcomes do improve, which they do, but it might take some time. So what we're interested in is to look at to what extent the career dynamics of immigrants differ from those of natives. There's been mostly the work on immigrant outcomes has used historically a lot of census data per force because there was no administrative data available. That has changed over the last decade or so. And some of the authors of prior work using administrative data in Canada are in this room, including Yuri, who sits at the table there. But by and large, a lot of the work before this, the last 10 years, was done with census data. So there's a lot of scope, potential scope for really improving our understanding of labor market dynamics for immigrants exploiting these new, really exciting data sources. Exciting as well as challenging. So to study the progress that I mentioned about how workers move from firm to firm, improve their labor market outcomes, we really need match employer-employee data. Okay, so this allows the study of the search process and the transition process of moving from lower paying to higher paying jobs. Hopefully, that's the idea, of course, that we're looking for in terms of outcomes of immigrants. So our contributions in this paper are, and will be, to look at two related questions. First, networking effects, which I'll just mention what's the game plan here that we will execute in due time, is to look at how immigrants sort into different firms as they assimilate following arrival and how job referral networks play a role in that process, okay? So we want to look at the growth, and for that part about networking, it's difficult conceptually to do it convincingly because we're talking about peer or social effects, and identifying social effects is always a challenge because of the famous reflection problem that, what's really causal versus just a correlation of a group having the same outcomes but not being able to tease out the effect of just the group composition versus really the causal relationship. So we want to look at the growth in earnings with time in Canada, as well as changes in the characteristics of jobs as a function, of course, of fraction of native Canadians at the firm and the size of the firm. And what we'll look at today more particularly is to look at the changes in mean firm effects. The firm effects is what are the different pay policies of the firms different from the, say, market value, the overall values of the skills that the workers, immigrants, and natives can take to any firm in the labor market. We want to see at the heterogeneity of firms, how they reward those skills. So we want to look at the changes in the mean firm effects, estimating using the Abad-Margolis two-way fixed effect model to assess the importance of the firm component as opposed to the individual component in terms of explaining the transitions from job to job and to better paying jobs, hopefully. So to investigate the networking effects, we will adapt and generalize a strategy using Schmut's paper of a few years ago. And he finds that people or individuals are more likely, it doesn't focus on immigrants, by the way, it's just a paper about networking effects. So we want to borrow that approach and use it in the context of immigrant improvement in labor market outcomes. So he shows that individuals are more likely to move to higher paying firms when their neighbors are themselves employed in high paying firms. This is a tricky way to assess. Initially, if you looked at a priori, it might look like a perfect example of a social reflection problem. So the way to identify these networking effects is he allows the selection of immigrants into neighborhoods. So there's some selection of people, not systematic selection, that would tend to bias the results in a certain direction. So he allows the non-random selection into neighborhoods, but he assumes that people don't select the block, the actual block in which they live. This is with US data. So the identifying assumption is that there's selection into neighborhoods. That's fine, we allow for that. And within neighborhoods, people don't actually select who's in the same block. And it's the people in the blocks whose labor market outcomes are seemingly strongly related to the people living in the same area. So Schmutz makes the causal statement that this is really a networking effect. He uses the LEHD data in the US, and in our case, we'd use the seed data. I'm not sure if I should say link to the Immigrant database, because it seems as though what I've seen this afternoon is that it's automatically done, but I don't think it is. My recollection, Beryl, would correct me, is that we asked for this merging of IMDb with the seed. Did we not? OK. I don't want to misstate anything here. And on top of that, we have tax data. Okay? So we can follow the firms. We have firm identifiers. We have firm characteristics about profits, sales, investments, and so forth that we'll be using in this paper. So the question we'll look at more particularly is what accounts for the immigrant-native wage gap. That's what I'll show you some work-in-progress results later on. So how firm-specific pay policies potentially affect immigrants and natives differently. And two channels are sorting and bargaining. So we adapt the framework used in David's paper with Cardozo and Klein, where they studied a male-female wage gap in Portugal. So the same sort of issue, but with males and females. And he tries to decompose, what they do is to decompose the firm-specific effects basically into two components. One is sorting, people sorting differently into jobs, whether it be females versus males or immigrants versus natives. And also a bargaining effect, meaning that within the same firm, in our case, immigrants might not get the same pay premium as do the natives. Okay? So the decomposition of, we want to decompose the firm effects into the sorting and bargaining components for both groups, natives and immigrants alike. And the sorting, of course, it measures the extent to which immigrants sort into different types of firms relative to natives. Okay? So if immigrants, for example, systematically sort into low-paying firms, then this will contribute a large part actually to the gap that we might observe in the raw data. The bargaining component is the degree to which immigrants get a smaller share of the surplus. Okay? So the surplus measure we'll be using, actually it's not that one, we'll be using that one, but actually the one we use in the paper, the results I'm going to show you are log sales per worker. It's one alternative measure of the surplus in a firm. Think of it as, not sure profits is not really the right way to think about it, but there's some sort of, think of a match between a worker and a firm generating some sort of surplus that needs to be shared between the firm and the worker. So we want to see which part of that surplus goes to the workers, be they natives or immigrants. So the basic estimating AKM model is the following. We're relating the log wage. We'll be using earnings because we don't have hours worked in these data, so we're using earnings. And as a function of the observables, the XIT variables, I indexes the individual, T the time, and J indexes the firms. So you'll see that the components over here, theta I is the unmeasured time-invariant worker-specific characteristic, whereas psi j is the unmeasured time-invariant firm characteristic. Okay? So those are the two parts that we want to identify separately. And the way to identify this, should talk a little bit more about the identification of such a model. You need to have mobility across firms. Otherwise, you cannot identify separately theta I from psi j. Okay? So there needs to be some mobility. And in fact, that's the interest of the paper, to see how the mobility patterns differ between natives and immigrants. So the difference in the time profiles of the firm effect at each time period would tell us something about the degree to which the career dynamics differ across the two groups. Okay, so that's part of the interest. Now, one way in which this model needs to be, we need to be clear about the identification. First of all, conditional on theta I and psi j, mobility across firms is exogenous. That's a strong assumption a priori without further testing of that assumption. It's actually something that can be tested to a degree. What I mean by conditional on theta I and psi j, that mobility is exogenous, it means that, in part, that people going from firm A to firm B and who gain, say, 10% on average, well, it should be the exact same magnitude, but with the inverse coefficient as the people going from firm B to firm A who should lose 10%. Okay, so it imposes a symmetry in the wage changes between joiners of a firm and leavers of a firm. So that's actually testable in the data that we have. Secondly, they need to be there. We cannot allow for people being in different trends, leading them to move from firm to firm. For example, a worker who's experiencing rapid wage growth is on a positive trend might switch a higher paying firm, whereas the other workers in the lower, in a slower or less upward slope trend would switch a lower paying firm. So we need to check whether the post-movement trends are the same as the pre-movement trends. So again, there's some ways to checking whether the exogenous mobility assumption holds true, at least to a degree. So we need, the firm's effects are identified by what we call a connected set, okay? You need to have sufficient mobility of both natives and immigrants across firms, either separately when we analyze immigrants separately from natives, or jointly. And if we estimate workers, immigrants and natives jointly, we need to have what we call a dual connected set, meaning that we need to have immigrants and natives moving across the same subset of firms, because otherwise we cannot make comparison of the two groups because they work possibly in different firms. If there's, for example, this completely eliminates segregation. Segregational, some jobs have only immigrants, other jobs have only natives, then we cannot do much with those firms. So we need to keep a certain level of connectedness to study the differences within firms between natives and immigrants. And that's the dual connected sets role here. So now, the point, the lower bullet point is actually important because it's one thing to do this exercise looking at male-female wage gaps, knowing that there are 50% more or less of each group. But for immigrants, this can be a problem. And Canada is a good place to do it because we have a large fraction, as you saw this morning, about 20% of the population in Canada is immigrant sources. So if we were, say, in some of the other countries that were at the top of the pictures that David showed this morning, it would be more problematic to do. Okay, so the fact we have a high fraction of immigrants is actually necessary to do this sort of exercise here. Okay, so the sorting versus the bargaining. So if you look at what we're interested in is the average thing of the expected value of the firm effects for immigrants minus the expected effect of the firm effects for the natives. Okay, so this is the mean difference in the estimated firm effects using the AKM model. Using a standard decomposition, Oaxaca blinder type decomposition, really, we can decompose this raw difference in two components. The first one represents the bargaining effect. Okay, conditional on the distribution of job held by immigrants, what is the average difference between the firm effects of immigrants and the firm effects of natives? The second line represents a sorting effect. What is the average firm effects for natives among immigrants? It should be, let's see. No, that's fine. The average, we're looking at the average firm effects for natives in immigrant jobs and in natives jobs, okay? So it needs to cancel out so that the first left-hand side is still satisfied, okay? So the second line is really just a sorting effect. Do immigrants sort into different type of firms, types in terms of the pay policies? We could do, of course, the other decomposition as usual in the Oaxaca blinder. We choose a group fairly arbitrarily. We can do it in the other direction as well, conditioning the bargaining effect on the native distribution of jobs and looking at the firm effects for immigrants it said the difference for firm effect for immigrants instead of natives. And as you'll see in the table I'm going to show you, it makes a difference which reference group we use, which is a bit troubling. Okay, so some descriptive stats. We're using data from 2008 to 2013. The initial plan was to use data starting in 2005, but I was told that the server disagreed eventually after a few days. And so consequently, we first had to limit the samples to cover the years 2008, 2013, and hopefully these problems will get sorted out as we move forward. So, there's not, whether you look at the overall analysis sample or the dual connected set, there isn't much difference in terms of composition. Of course, except that earnings tend to be, the dual connected set, immigrants tend to be paid somewhat less than in the overall immigrant sample, but really there's not that much in terms of major differences in terms of sociodemographics. Of course, when you look at the fraction of natives in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia versus fraction of immigrants, you see that Ontario, of course, and British Columbia are the major recipients of immigrants, especially considering the fact that Quebec is more populated than British Columbia. Okay, so the fraction of immigrants at firms, it's fairly stable again across the various samples that we used. And we have mean log sales. Again, there's not much to choose across, so it's kind of reassuring in a way. TBC here is to be computed. Again, it's one of those things that hasn't quite been figured out yet by the machinery, I guess, to see how many number of firms and persons that we have in our data set. This here should be ILU, meaning individual labor unit. It's a way of basically taking into account the fact that some workers in a given year may work for 2 different firms, for example, or 3 different firms. Okay, so we take that into account in calculating the mean log sales by labor unit. But it doesn't make much difference whether you use that or simply log sales per worker. Okay, so a summary of the estimated two-way fixed effects. So the standard deviation of earnings is bigger, somewhat bigger for natives than for immigrants. This is log annual earnings, as I said. And as you can see, you can immediately appreciate the computational challenge involved in this exercise here. The nature of the software is such that it tries to load everything into memory. Consequently, it needs a gigantic amount of memory to digest all these data before estimating. So that's one of the issues that we have. So if you look at the correlation between, there's correlation between immigrants and native firm effects, the firm pay policies is fairly high. Okay, so there's a lot of similarities in the pay policies across the 2 groups, whether they be native or immigrants. Interestingly, what we find so far is that the correlation with the person and firm effects are non-positive. As you'll notice here, there are no standard errors yet, or I haven't shown them here, but it's actually quite, what this suggests here, contrary to a couple of papers, maybe not in the immigrant native literature, but in the male-female literature and in other settings, such as in Germany, when people have used worker firm data, there seems to be positive assortative matching, meaning that this correlation here should be positive. It's been positive in other contexts, but not here. Okay. The interest in the positive correlation of firm and person effect, the substantive idea behind it is that if it's positive, it means that over time you might see that might be an explanation for expanding inequalities. As people of the high ability people increasingly sort into high-paying firms, just that in itself, this process will expand earnings inequality. Okay, so we don't seem to have that in the data that we have here. The share of, if we decompose the inequality of the two-way fixed effects model, we have the share of the variance due to person and firm effects is fairly similar for both groups, but the contribution of the person and firm effect is bigger in relative terms for immigrants, much bigger than it is for natives. Okay? The residual here, I should say something about the adjusted R squared. If you look at the Cardozo-Klein paper, you'll see that the correlation, the R square is 0.95, okay? It's because this one here doesn't include the contribution of the firm and person effects. If we did include that, it would be about the same, like 0.9, 0.95, okay? So by default, this is sort of the R square model, but net of this effect, these person and firm effects. Okay, the contribution to the immigrant dual connected firm. So first of all, probably should have started with that. The earnings gap for everybody in the sample is 16%, okay? 16 log points, about 16%. And for male is slightly higher. Okay, so there's no surprise here. There's a positive earnings gap, especially when you consider that immigrants arriving recently always start lower and takes a while before converging. And the gap is bigger for males than for females. And here when we say, it might seem like a strange way to native premium among native and immigrant premium among immigrants, because they sort differently across jobs, we need to concentrate on just calculating the average premiums for the immigrants within that set of across the jobs that they hold, which is of a different distribution than it is for natives. So hence the insistence of having native premium among natives seems like a redundant. But if there was no sorting across firms differently for natives and immigrants, we would need this qualifier there. And so the contribution to the wage gap of both of the firm component is actually 28%. So it's not nothing. It's kind of significant that there's close to 30% of the wage gap between immigrants and natives comes from differences in the firm-specific components of psi j that I showed you earlier. Okay. And it's especially true for females, where it's 49%. This is really a big number relative to males. There's a big difference for females relative to males in this instance for immigrants, and not so much for natives. If we look, and this is where things get murky. Not so much for sorting, okay? So if these two columns reflect which reference group basically we use in the decomposition, okay? So there's still a big difference, mind you, but it's not as spectacular as you see here for the bargaining component. So basically what this tells you here, if you look across, whether you use the native distribution for the bargaining effect or you use the immigrant distribution of jobs, when I say distribution of jobs, it's just a fraction of immigrants across the jobs in each job. That's used as the weight to get the average firm effects and the bargaining effects, okay? So if you look at those two things here, first of all, it's disturbing that there's such a big difference depending on which group we use, okay, as the reference. But there's absolutely no evidence of a bargaining effect, which is somewhat surprising. So, which takes me back to saying that there's something about work in progress, and the key word here is in progress. Okay. So it could be one factor which could drive this is the normalization that we use. So if I go back to the decomposition I showed you earlier, the second term, the sorting effect here does not depend on the normalization. So that's why the sorting results are fairly stable, whether you use one group or the other. But the sorting, the normalization that you use does influence the bargaining component, okay? So the normalization that we use, basically what we do is to say, okay, you can only identify firm effects by taking a reference group within firms. It's like when you estimate male-female wage gap, if you put a gender dummy, by default, if the dummy is equal to 1, if it's a female, by default, the reference group is the male, okay? So we need to do the same thing for firm effects here. We need to pick a reference group. So there are different ways of doing it. The way we do it is to look at the firms that are the bottom 10% of the surplus distribution. We set the firm effects to 0 for those firms, okay? So consequently, the firm effects that we estimate are relative to those low surplus firms. We could have used a low wage industry, for example, services, restaurants, hotels, and we'll do that just to make sure that we're consistent, to check the sensitivity of the results. So this component here, the bargaining effect, does depend on the normalization, but not the sorting. So I suspect that what you see here is a reflection of the sensitivity, possibly, to the normalization that we use. And this is something that really we need to work on seriously. As you see, the sorting effect is important, okay? It could be very important or very, very important, but it's more stable, obviously, than this bargaining component. Having said that there's no bargaining effect, this first bullet point is somewhat silly. It was written before realizing that it's not positive. But the point is actually I left it there because we call it bargaining, but is this really the right way to think about this, the gap that's not accounted by sorting? And there's a general fashion, okay, before seeing the negative coefficients that you saw. Recognition of credentials may generate some patterns that affect the differences in the firm effects for both groups. Although one might think that it will affect the person effect, the theta i's, more so than the firm effects, but that's an empirical question, okay? The sensitivity to the reference group is an issue, as usual, unfortunately, in Oaxaca blinder types decompositions. And we have to operationalize the approach used by Schmutt in his Journal of Labor Economics paper. An issue, of course, there are few cities in Canada where immigrants tend to cluster. Actually, I don't think it's such a problem because we can decompose. Toronto is a big place. And there are many, many neighborhoods in Toronto. So I think the approach could be profitably used in the Canadian context as well, even though we don't have 300 million plus population as they do in the US, which makes the life of labor economists so much easier. Okay, thank you.